going to read the book The Magic Finger. There was a girl. She had neighbors. They were the Gregs. The Gregs had 2 children. They were William and Philip. Philip is 8 years old. The girl is also 8 years old, but William is 11 years old. The Greg's most favorite thing to do is hunting, but the girl hated hunting because she thinks that killing animals just for the fun they get out of it is not good at all. She talked to the boys about it. Whenever she goes to their farm to play, she even talks them out of it. She tries, but the boys never listen to her. Even once she tried talking to the boy's father, but he just ignored her and just walked away without responding to her like she was not even there. That was it. She saw red and then it began to happen. The magic finger. She just did it, wiggling, zapping. Some sparklings just came out of her finger and hit the Gregs. Oh no, she never wanted to do the magic finger again in her life. The magic finger, that was something that she could do all her life. Once, her teacher, Mrs. Winter, was telling a spelling contest, also known as a spell bee. When she asked her how to spell cat, she said, "That's an easy one, K-A-T." But that was not the correct spelling. So she said, "Oh, you are a very stupid girl. Go stand in the corner." But the girl said, "I am not a stupid girl." And she said, "No, you have to go stand in the corner." That was it. She saw red and that began to happen. The magic finger. She just did like this and that was it. From Mrs. Winter's face, long whiskers began to grow out of her nose here. And then they were just like a cat's, but they were longer. All the children in the class began to laugh at Mrs. Winter. Mrs. Winter said, "Oh, could you all please stop laughing of what is there in the class?" And then when she turned to write on the blackboard with her chalk, then only she realized that she had gotten whiskers and a tail too. The tail was like a cat's tail. Everybody began to laugh. And if you want to know more, there's nothing I want to tell you. And if you have a question, is Mrs. Winter all right now? No, she's not all right and she never will be. And then, now back to the story. When the magic finger hit the Gregs, it hit Philip, William, their father, and even Mrs. Greg, who wasn't even with them. I did not want to hear more about the magic finger, so I just ran back to the house. That was when they got a deer and they were coming. The next day, nothing had still happened to them. The next day morning, they went out to hunt some wild ducks. They started shooting the wild ducks. In the first hour, they got 10 wild ducks. In the next hour, they got 6 more. And then, it was getting a little dark. There were 4 more ducks remaining. In the other half of the hour, they tried to shoot them, but since it was dark, they couldn't see. So Mr. Greg said, "Let's go back home. We can't see anything." But when they were going, the wild ducks from up above swooped down onto them. But then they didn't like it. Mr. Greg said, "Go away, you silly ducks. Go away. The ducks followed them all the way to the home. When they went inside, they raced inside the door and slammed it shut. The very same day when they went to sleep, when Philip and William was sleeping, Mr. Greg went out of the house to search for some firewood. Then the 4 wild ducks came swooping down about him. He got scared and he went back inside the house. He said, "Let us go and get firewood tomorrow." And he slept along with Mrs. Gregg. The very next morning, Mr. Gregg was the first to wake up in the house. When he woke up, he stretched out his hand to check the time, but his hand wouldn't come out. He would have injured that hand somehow, so he moved the other hand, but that wouldn't come out either. And then he said, "I wonder what's happened." So he jumped out of bed. And then that was when he saw that he had got a pair of wings instead of a pair of arms. That time, Mrs. Gregg woke up when Mr. Gregg let out a yell. She woke up and said, another yell, and she said, "Oh no, what has happened to you?" When she moved this arm, Mr. Gregg saw something and he said, "You mean what has happened to us?" And then now it was Mrs. Gregg's turn to jump out of the bed. When she jumped up, she too had got a pair of wings. And it was not just the wings, they had gotten tinier. Mr. Gregg was tiny, and now Mrs. Gregg was even tinier than Mr. Gregg. And then the children came inside. They were flying up in the sky. Mrs. Gregg said, "No flying in the sky. Come down, that is much too high." But by the time she could finish her sentence, the boys flew out of the window. And then Mrs. Gregg asked to Mr. Gregg, "Should we also do that?" Mr. Gregg said, "I don't see why not." So he began flapping his wings hard, and then after a matter of time, they began flying, and then they went straight out of the window. By the time they saw, the boys were high up in the sky. And then they started enjoying the wonderful feeling of flying. William said, "Oh, I've always wanted to be a bird." And Mr. Gregg asked Mrs. Gregg, "Are your wings feeling all right?" Mrs. Gregg said, "Oh, they are feeling wonderful." And then Philip spotted something on the ground. "Hey, what's that on our farm?" They began swooping down. It was the 4 ducks. And what was even stranger, that they had arms instead of wings. They were standing in a line. Mr. Gregg said, "Oh, don't you dare, that is my house. Don't go inside." The first duck just quacked and let out an arm and opened the door and went inside. The others followed, and before Mr. Gregg could go inside, they slammed the door shut. And then they all sat down on the wall next to the door, next to the house, and they were all crying. And then Mr. Gregg let out an idea. "How about we build a nest?" "A nest?" they all said together. "Yes, we have no other choice. We don't have our house to sleep in," he said, pointing at the house. They all agreed. So they all flew up to search for a tree to build the nest. Mr. Gregg picked the perfect tree and picked the branch they would be building the nest in. He said, "Get the sticks, lots of sticks." They all flew out to search for sticks. But before they do, William asked Mr. Greg, "But how do we hold the sticks?" "With your mouths," he said. Then Mr. Greg was really good at making the sticks stick together, and Mrs. Greg was really good at finding sticks. By the time, after a long time, Mr. Greg said, "That's enough sticks. Now find me leaves, feathers, cotton, like that to make the inside fluffy." They all went out and searched, and by a long time they had completed the nest. And then Mrs. Greg sat inside and said, "Oh, I feel like I will be laying an egg any moment." And then Philip asked, "Dad, we haven't had anything to eat since morning. What shall we eat?" he said. Mr. Greg said, "We will go to the house and find an open window and go inside like that. And when the ducks are not looking, we will go get the tin of biscuits in the kitchen." By the time they swooped down to the house, they saw that all the windows were locked. Mrs. Gregg spotted a duck cooking in her kitchen stove. She said, "How dare that ugly duck cook in my stove?" When they flew more, Mr. Gregg saw his gun held by another wild duck. When they flew further, William saw in one of the top windows that a duck was sleeping in his bed. Then Philip saw that one of the ducks was playing with his toy electric train. They all got so angry and went back. William said, "I don't want to eat worms or slugs." "Me neither," said Philip. And then Mrs. Gregg said, "Oh, just think of it. Just eat it and you won't even know." She said, "Think of delicious worm burgers or wonderful slug burgers," she said. But the boys said, "No, we will not eat those very, very icky looking insects." Mr. Gregg said, "How about we try some apples?" They all agreed, and so they went in search of apples. When they found the apples, they started biting into them. It was very hard to eat apples without your hands, because whenever you get your mouth closer to the fruit, it just pushes away. By the end, everybody got a little few pieces each of the apples. When they went back to the nest, when they sat down in the rain to get comfortable to sleep, it just started to rain very, very heavily. It rained and rained. They all got drenched in the heavy rain, and the nest was as wet as can be. In the morning, the sun shone with the warm rising sun. William said, "Oh, I'm happy to have the sun back in the sky. I do not like this wet, wet rain, especially inside this nest." And then, in the morning, when they all woke up, Mrs. Gregg turned like this, and then she saw, "Ah!" she yelled. And then Mr. Gregg said, "Oh, what is it?" And she said, look like this." When he saw there were the 4 wild ducks, they each were holding one gun. One was holding Mr. Gregg's gun, one was holding Philip's gun, and one was holding William's gun, and one was standing without any gun, very frustrated and angry. Mrs. Gregg and Mr. Gregg said, "No, please don't shoot, please don't shoot." They said, "Why not? It was the one without any gun." She said, "Because ducks are not allowed to." It said, "How are humans allowed to shoot ducks then?" "That's because they are allowed to." It asked why. Because we allow each other. The duck said, then we will also allow each other to shoot you. Everybody got very scared. And Mrs. Gregg said, oh, here are our two children. Please don't shoot them, please. And then the duck said, you shot my children. You shot all 6 of my children. They got very angry and Mr. Gregg said, oh please, I'll do anything you ask if you just say not to hit us with those guns. The duck said, okay, fine. And then he said, will you not shoot any wild duck or any ducks again? I will not, said Mr. Gregg. Okay then, will you not shoot any deer again? I will not shoot any animals again in my life. Then when you go home, I request you to break your guns. They agreed, and then when they jumped out of their nest and started flapping their wings, a ray of black came over them. And then it changed to red, to green, to blue, and then to gold. And then they were back in their own farm, standing with arms in front of their house. And everybody was so happy. And then it must have been an hour later that the girl entered into their farm to check if everything was all right. She found in one corner that Mr. Gregg was smashing his gun with a big axe, and Mrs. Gregg in one lawn putting flowers on top of 16 mounds of soil, and the 2 boys scattering the best barley of the farm to all the birds. And then that's when I asked why, and they told me the whole story. And they pointed me the nest in top of the tree. This is all about the magic finger. Thank you.